Imagine the air so sharp it feels like small knives on the inside of your throat. You pull your cloak tighter with numb fingers, smell the wet smoke of yesterday's hearth mingling with the sour tang of old ale, and hear the house settling as ice pushes at its foundations. Close your eyes for a second and feel the tiny heat of ember under ash, the texture of thatch tightly bound above your head, and the way your own breath fogs into a small pale cloud that vanishes before the door opens. You wake to a village in the deep of winter, somewhere in northern Europe around the 14th century, where frost writes its name across every window and the granary door stays locked against hunger. Here, keeping the embers alive is not sentiment. It is a duty that determines whether the next day belongs to you. If you like these kinds of sensory journeys, like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Now close the shutters, breathe in, lay a hand over the warm rim of a pot, and step with me into a night that will teach us how cold shapes what people do, who they trust, and what they fear. By the end of this tale, you will not only know the techniques of preserving meat and the hymns they sang by the chapel, you will understand how frost carved law into daily life, and how small mercies kept entire households alive. What did people do when the milk froze and the bailiff came asking for taxes? Inside the main room of a small longhouse, the light squats low, like something hiding. The hearth is a shallow pit lined with blackened stone, and a handful of embers glow like red eyes under a heap of ash. The walls smell of smoke and wet wool. You touch the warm lip of a wooden bowl, feel the roughness where a spoon has been carved and reworked, and you can taste the thin broth as if the steam were a memory on your tongue. There are at least 5 kinds of textures here, and your hands learn them by repetition. The brittle leather of a boot, the greasy thread of a mended cloak, the crisp rim of frozen lard, the powdery feel of flour sifted through a hair sieve, and the slick, cold skin of a preserved onion. There is a family in this room, and they speak in quick, practical sentences because there is always work to plan. "How much grain do we have left?" asks Edda, who runs the larder with the patience of someone used to counting months by handfuls. "Enough for a week and a day if we ration," Thomas answers, rubbing the edge of his thumb where a rope left a raw corded line. He speaks with a voice that tries to be a calculation and becomes a prayer. "Week and a day is not a season," Matilda says, folding more wool into the drying rack. "What can we trade?" Edda asks. "The ale is done, but the barrels are low." "I could take the ox to market when the thaw comes," Thomas offers. "No," Matilda snaps, "not the ox. We need thresh for next sowing." "I will go," Jory the miller says, stepping forward. "I know the road. I will cover my face, bring news, maybe a sack of flour for a favor." "Who will watch the child?" Edda asks, and the room quiets. A small cough answers, before a voice that belongs to the child says, "I can help." "Do not send the child," Matilda replies sharply, and then softer she adds, "Not yet. Let Jory go. The bailiff will come in 3 days. If he sees an empty barn, he will count it as theft." "Then hide the last sacks near the hearth," Thomas suggests, "under the thatch ridge where no one looks." "Who will bear the extra work?" Jory asks. "I cannot both grind and travel." "I will spin through the night," Matilda says, "and mend every cloak. We will weave something to barter." The dialogue stretches to 7 exchanges before settling like coals beneath a pot. It is not theatrical. It is the rhythm of the room where every question is a ledger entry against tomorrow. Each voice gives you a different map of responsibility. Edda double-checks the granary list out loud, naming the 5 sacks by weight and origin, as if speaking them keeps them real. Thomas counts out the moss that will serve as insulation when animal hides are thin. Matilda smooths a patch while humming a fragment of a hymn that Brother Anselm in the nearby chapel taught to quiet the children. Outside, someone rattles a bucket, and you hear the brittle clacking of frozen hinges. The protagonist who anchors this tale is a woman called Edda, mid-30s, whose hands tell a life of steady labor and small victories.
Her backstory is long enough to hold the shape of this winter. She grew up by a river where summers were fat with eel and barley, learning to mend nets and to pick bones clean for broth. Her father taught her to read inventories from monastic records that sometimes came through like maps of other people's goods. And from him, she learned that memory can be stored in lists. As a young woman, she married Tomas, who had a laugh that could scare wolves, and together they bore one child and rebuilt a roof after a fire. When famine struck 3 winters ago, she lost a sister to fever, and the grief taught her how to lay out meager food like a teacher arranging lessons. She is practical, tenacious, and given to small rituals, like leaving a coin beneath the hearth for luck. Her knowledge of preservation is hands-on. Her decisions are often moral and legal at once, and her
main fear is not for herself, but for the child's future. She is the kind of person who will memorize the sequence of a feast so she can distribute equally later. In the present, she is the one who decides when to break a loaf. Opposing what Edda tries to hold together is not a single villain, so much as a series of rising pressures collected into the person of the bailiff, Richard. His backstory is lean and practical. He was raised in a coastal town where trade made men swift with coin and quicker with promises. He learned the law as a way to climb, not to protect, and he reads inventories like scripture. He believes order is kept by strict accounting and that mercy is a luxury in times of scarcity. Richard is efficient, and his orders are backed by the Lord's writ. He does not enjoy taking grain, but he insists that dues be paid. He is not cruel for cruelty's sake, but his duty requires him to collect, and that is often indistinguishable from cruelty in the eyes of those with empty bins. Underneath the efficiency, there is a story of a man who once had a wife who left for the city and never returned, and the vacancy made him prefer certainty over risk. He distrusts improvisation and fears contagion of anarchy. His presence in the village is a force that will bend decisions and reveal how systems of power exert themselves during a frost. Around these 2 pivot people exist other named neighbors and their actions. Brother Anselm lights candles at the chapel, reciting short Latin phrases and recording entries in the book of the hospital. Matilda mends cloaks and tends a small chest of tinctures learned from old women who knew herbs, and she performs small inoculations of poultice when children cough. Jory the miller grinds grain and sends favors to his kin. Hilda the alewife keeps 3 kegs that can be traded for a sling of flour. Bailiff Richard rides in with 2 men at arms and a list of demands. Lady Isabel in the manor strands out coins with the grace of someone who has never counted nights. Owen the cooper repairs barrels and keeps an extra lid for emergency storage. Each of these people does something concrete. Brother Anselm endorses a record, Matilda prepares a tincture, Jory waits at the road, Hilda offers ale for labor, Owen seals a barrel. Their names appear in inventories and in your memory because they are the threads that hold the social fabric when frost tightens. The interior scene shows not only individuals but procedural detail. You learn that to preserve meat, they hang salted joints in a cool larder and smoke what will not last, rubbing salt into flesh and packing it in barrels of brine. A technical explanation runs like this. Salting requires rubbing coarse salt into the flesh to draw moisture, then layering pieces with herbs or smoke
to repel flies, and finally sealing in a cool, dry place to reduce bacterial growth. That process takes days of work and a store of salt that many households do not own. You can imagine the smell of smoke and the grainy bite of salt under your nose while fat drips into copper. The work is ceremonial in its focus and technical in its limitations. Archaeological studies and monastic inventories confirm such practices in many regions, showing that households balanced meat with grain and ale in seasonal charts. When you leave the warmth of the hearth, the sensory world broadens. The village itself is a small lattice of paths sunk into packed snow. The sound of boot on frozen mud is metronomic. You can smell smoke from distant chimneys, tangy smoke from charred wood, and the sweet reek of fermenting ale from Hilda's yard where barrels breathe. Visual contrasts bite. The black line of a thatch roof, white drifts against rough timber, and the wink of metal on a plow. You hear a dog barking, a child's shriek as they slip on ice, and the distant clop of a human who has far to walk. There are textures underfoot that tell you the village has seen many winters. Compacted dung, hay that has been trodden into paths, and the caked silt along a wall where rats have left traces. The village economy is a tight weave of obligations and barters. Grain is the central currency, and the granary is a sacred place. The granary keeper lists names and weights, and you watch Edda count and speak each entry aloud, because names make debts human. Taxes are paid not with coin, but with tithes of grain, ale, or labor. You meet 5 named locals who act within this economy. There is Thomas the farmer, who threshes and mends a plow; Jory the miller, who steadies a sack of flour on his shoulder; Owen the cooper, who repairs a broken wheel for a measure of rye; Hilda, who exchanges a jug of ale for a mending; and Maud the weaver, who trades fabric for 10 loaves. Each one performs a specific barter. Thomas will lend an ox for plowing; Jory will grind free for a share; Owen will fashion barrel lids for payment in ale; Hilda will barter kegs for sewn garments; and Maud will weave a cloak from saved wool in exchange for a week of meals. The procession of goods feels like a living ledger, where every favor counts. At the manor, the contrast is immediate. Inside the castle, great tapestries hang heavy, softening the chill. The great hall smells of more robust fare: roasted root, the perfume of spiced wine, and the faint medicinal scent from a monk's tincture that flows from the windowsill where it warms. Here, embers are not a scarce red eye, but a broad band of glow under an enormous hearth, where a roast turns slowly. Lady Isabel and her steward move
Rituals of comfort. Their warmth is managed. Heated stones chopped and shuttled, many layers of fur, and servants trained in the mechanical art of warmth. There is a moment of tension when Bailiff Richard presents a list of due tithes in front of the Lord Steward. Voices rise. "These accounts are for the good of the manor," Richard says, his tone flat and professional. "The people cannot give what they do not have," Lady Isabel replies, her voice composed but distant. "It is not my pleasure to collect," Richard says, "it is my order." "If you take their last sacks, the next sowing will fail," the steward adds. "You will note that the writ is clear," Richard says, tapping the page. "And yet," the Lord interjects, "mercy is also our obligation, perhaps a respite until thaw." This exchange, quick and laden with authority, shows how elites balance image, resources, and obligation. The tension is social rather than physical, but it will ripple outward. The hall is full of sensory detail: the scratch of quills, the whisper of silk, the warmth under a heavy fur collar, the metallic clink of a coin box, and the taste of spiced wine that lingers like a decision. Outside the hall, the village holds its own ritual of relief in the form of a midwinter festival, an odd mix of joy and control. When the river freezes, the market may move onto the ice, an improvised stage for barter, song, and watchfulness. The festival day smells of roasting meat, crushed herbs, and warmed ale. Music latches onto rhythms that feel older than the lordship, with drums and simple flutes setting a pulse that invites people to move and forget. There is a character here, a woman known only as the keeper of feasts, who organizes the communal stew, cuts the roast in a way that looks like ritual, and leads a procession to the chapel carrying a small relic borrowed from Brother Anselm. In the crowd, you notice a young man, Jory's son, who steals a piece of meat and passes it to a freezing child. No one sees it first, but someone always does. Dialogues in this scene are plentiful. The keeper of feasts instructs her helpers, sounding like a conductor. "Lift the pot," she calls. "Stir from the center. Add the herbs now." A helper replies, "Which herbs do you want, thyme or the dried lavender?" She answers, "Thyme. The lavender is for the stew at dawn." Another voice, a child, asks for extra bread. "Not now," the keeper says, and then softer, "Later, go and fetch water."
The conversation goes on with 6 or 7 exchanges as a rhythm of labor and joy. The festival is sensory in 5 to 6 ways. The heat on your face from the fire, the ringing timbre of flutes, the sticky sweetness of sugared root, the roughness of straw used for seating, the glow of torches against pale faces, and the sharpness of smoke
that draws tears. In the middle of the feast, someone whispers of a secret rite, a small offering to ensure granary safety. It is a ritual that mixes Christian procession with older seasonal practices, and Brother Anselm records it in the monastery book as folk custom, a guarded note. Religious life threads through daily survival. The chapel stands small and squat, a place where light comes through thick glass like a slow promise. The relic they display might be a bone or a cloth associated locally with a saint, and people file past it to touch and hope. The process of a simple healing ritual is practical and repeated. A technical description: to prepare a poultice for a deep chill, the healer would mash warm barley with warmed milk, add a small tincture of comfrey and willow bark, apply the paste to the affected limb, wrap in clean linen, and keep near the hearth to slowly return warmth to the tissue. The tincture often contains alcohol or vinegar as a preserving agent and a small measured amount of herb to reduce inflammation. These practices combine domestic knowledge with church oversight, and monks sometimes kept short lists of which herbs were safe. Monastic records and later herbal compilations bear witness to these techniques. Disease and war strand themselves across the same map. The winter concentrates suffering. Camps are set up for those taken from the village to the Lord's muster, or for soldiers who travel through on damp campaigns. You will see field hospitals where straw pellets are pressed into wounds, and you will see an infirmary cornered in a monastery where a monk measures fever against the calendar. A moment of acute tension erupts when a traveler arrives carrying a cough that will not abate. The village instinctively divides into caution and compassion. Send him to the chapel, Brother Anselm says. We will isolate. If we isolate, the mead will be untouched and go sour, Hilda replies. Is it better to lose ale than lose a neighbor? Matilda asks. The tension here spans moral, practical, and biological concerns. This is a scene of 500 to 600 characters expanded into 2 paragraphs of emotion and practical decisions. The smell of sickness, the soft rustle of linen, the way people avoid touching hands, the quiet counting of spoons left unused. There are at least 3 other moments of tension in the winter. One is when the bailiff counts the granary and finds it short. The other when a pack of wolves descends on a small herd near dawn. And the third when a rumor of soldiers passing through leads men to gather arms rather than harvest. Each of these moments stretches about 500 to 600 characters and occupies 2 to 3 paragraphs, showing the mechanics of fear and resolve. When wolves come, the village must decide whether to risk open fields to drive them away. The men choose to set fires and use noise to confuse the pack, sacrificing a barn's
worth of straw to buy minutes. The wolves are repelled but at a cost. When the bailiff finds the shortfall, the social contracts are tested. The Lord argues for written dues. Villagers answer with the language of necessity. During the rumor of soldiers, the youth sharpen spears, and the elders send women to hide valuable things in the granary's false wall. These are not melodrama, they are choices in small increments that add up to whether a household survives. Regional differences shape everything. To the north, winters are a long, compressed presence of ice and lean meat. Boats might be pulled up and left frozen, and in some coastal towns, the market uses the frozen sea as a gathering place, turning a hazard into a stage. In the Mediterranean, the cold is less about ice and more about damp that seeps and ruins stored grain, and communities rely more on preserved citrus and oil. You will hear 2 or 3 micro-stories: a Norse family who share fire through a common longhouse roof, a Mediterranean widow who lights citron candles to keep mold from grain, and a traveling merchant who maps the varieties of ale he has tasted across climates. The image of sharing the flame appears twice, first as a physical practice of passing hot stones between houses, and second as a symbolic act of mutual aid that binds communities across different geographies. Along the way, there are small practical details that feel like ritual knowledge.
The process of smoking meat described earlier expands to include the architecture of a smokehouse, a tight wooden box above a slow smoldering of peat or green wood, with meat hung from beams and a lower vent to keep insects from reaching it. Salt was often purchased at market, and the relative scarcity of salt explains why families ration seasoned meat for special days. Sources like monastic inventories and manuals of agriculture, along with modern archaeological studies, corroborate the presence of smokehouses and the importance of salt in food economies. At roughly 1/3 of the story, a pause for you. Before I take you deeper, stop and think. If you had to decide today what to eat tomorrow, what would you do? Would you ration, share everything, or seek help beyond your village? Write in the comments what choice you would make. You can simply write ration, share, or seek help. Many of you have lived similar choices in different forms, and your answers help others understand the human texture behind these decisions. We read them and sometimes bring the most thoughtful ones into future discussions. Thank you for sharing. Now, let us return to a superstition that people used to guard bread during the worst frost. Superstitions thread through daily life as both comfort and control. One old belief held that a loaf should be baked with the first water drawn on a festival morning, so the first heat of the day would bless the bread. Another practice hummed
Small twigs of juniper over the larder to repel vermin. Brother Anselm once wrote in his notes that villagers prayed to Saint Blaise to keep throats clear of cold, while also using an older rite of laying a small scrap of cloth under a loaf. These practices are not opposed to each other. They coexist as layered strategies that combine ecclesiastical liturgy with folk remedies. A few moments demand a closer narrative lens. The day the bailiff comes is one such day. The granary gate creaks as a hand opens it, and the cold air moves like an accusatory finger. People line themselves like a record being read. The bailiff reads names. He weighs a sack and says the number out loud. Each pronouncement carries a legal weight. The leader of the village, an elder named Harold, steps forward to explain a missing cash. "We lent it for a lost child," Harold says. "We will repay." "Repayment is not this season's currency," Richard replies. Their exchange stretches, the tension a slow thing. This scene is long enough to include procedural detail about manorial demands and the language used in tithing. It also shows how public humiliation and bargaining operate as social tools. In a second sequence, wolves threaten a small herd, and the village has to choose between confronting them or losing the animals that sustain them. The men make a plan that involves fire, noise, and distraction, and one young man is injured, bringing the fear of infection to the fore. The third scene shows a caravan of soldiers passing through the valley and requisitioning horses and grain, leaving fear like a trace. At the heart of these actions, there are repeated sensory markers. Fire recurs as center, heat, and metaphor. The sound of frost cracking, the smell of smoke, the taste of thin stew, the roughness of mended cloth, and the sight of small lights in a snowy field are leitmotifs that return as the story moves between household, village, and manor. Repetition anchors the narrative and gives the impression that these are not isolated incidents, but patterns. The thaw arrives like a slow unfastening. Ice melts in stages, from the edges of the pond inward, from the roof drips to the rivulets in the street. The thaw is a season of decisions. Seed is placed, wounds are tended, and debts recalculated. There is a long section that narrates the thaw and its social consequences. People repair the thatch, reevaluate what survived, and celebrate with modest feasts that mark the end of scarcity. The thaw also brings its own hazards, flooded paths, burst cellars, and the stirrings of vermin. But mostly it brings a collective release. In the run of those days, the village holds a small feast where the community shares salt pork and a common ale. The keeper of feasts leads a procession to the chapel and offers the relic back with a murmured thank you. Brother Anselm writes the event into the monastery records
as a petition and a testament to community cohesion. Before we close, several technical processions deserve clear explanation. First, the smoking and salting of meat has been covered, but here is a brief technical note on brewing ale that many households use during winter months. Brewing begins with malting barley, which is soaked, allowed to germinate slightly, then dried. The malt is ground and mixed with warm water to extract sugars. The wort is boiled with herbs for flavor, cooled, and then fermented in a sealed barrel with yeast. The process takes days and requires clean vessels to avoid contamination. This craft is both household survival and social glue, because ale is safer to drink than often contaminated water, and it provides calories. Second, the healing tincture used by Mathilde combines the medicinal properties of comfrey, which aids tissue repair, willow bark as a fever reducer, and an alcoholic base to preserve the herbs. The mixture is distilled carefully and stored in dark glass or ceramic to retain potency. These processional details served as the baseline of rural medicine, and mention of monastic manuals and later herbal codices supports their use. The final arc brings us to thaw and epilogue. The winter ends, but not in a single moment. It is triaged into months of consequence that reshape lives. 1 month later, the village counts what remains and what was lost. 3 months later, planting begins in earnest, and 6 months later, the festival of harvest shows the footprints of winter on bodies and law. The epilogue unfolds in 3 snapshots. 1 month after the frost begins to loosen. Edda sits by a hearth that is smaller than before, but still warm. The granary has been partially rebuilt, using saved thatch and borrowed nails. The child laughs more easily, and the injured young man walks with a limp that will not fully leave. The bailiff has recorded some payments and delayed others, leaving debts that will be repaid in labor. Brother Anselm has stitched wounds and kept a ledger of who received aid. The community is exhausted but not undone. People make a list of names to help first in seed purchases, pooling a small sum to buy salt and a sack of rye. There is a new tacit agreement that no family will be left to starve without notice. The smell of fresh-cut wood now mingles with the dried herbs in Mathilde's small chest. Life proceeds in small, repaired motions. 3 months, in the thaw, has turned to planting. The village moves as a single organism. The granary is lower than the previous year, but not empty. Jory grinds and sends half his stock to neighbors who owed him labor in winter. Owen has finished sealing barrels for the first harvest, and Helda brews an ale that tastes like a prayer and a memory. Conversations change from immediate survival logistics to the shape of the next year. Lady Isabel sends a small cart of seed with a steward.
A face that reads like relief. The Lord has realized that taking too much in winter risks losing future rent. The soldiers who passed through months ago have left rumors that position is shifting, and that uncertainty tightens some nerves but loosens others into plans of trade. 6 months after melt, the field is a patchwork of green and brown, and the harvest ritual is already a promise held in the body. There is a small festival where the keeper of feasts carves the first roast, and Brother Anselm blesses the table. The bailiff comes and announces a new schedule of dues that accounts for losses. People greet him with cautious smiles. The injured man who survived the wolves is now called more often to help with heavy labor and earns dignity as well as food. Edda's child runs in prayer processions, and Mathilda's tinctures are sought for minor complaints. The village economy has shifted. Some families have become more interdependent, community obligations tightened, and social bonds have strengthened in ways that will shape future winters. The epilogue records concrete consequences. A shared seed fund, a written list of owes in a communal ledger kept by Brother Anselm, and a plan to repair the granary wall. The moral residue is clear. Winter was a teacher that left its marks on bodies, on rules, and on generosity. Throughout this story, you have encountered sensory markers and procedural notes, micro-histories and named people, moments of tension that test systems, and practical techniques that medieval people used to endure cold. I have referenced monastic inventories and agrarian manuals and archaeological studies in order to anchor reconstructions. These sources are not exact quotes, but are the kinds of records historians use to reconstruct practices of storage, brewing, and healing. If this journey into frost and ember touched you, consider subscribing.
Here we bring research and feeling together, and your subscription keeps this work alive. Join our community and share your thoughts in the comments, where your single-word answer or longer memory helps others connect present choices with past ones. For now, imagine the fire reduced to ember and the sound of thawing water in a gutter, and hold for a moment the knowledge that survival in winter was never only physical. It was social, legal, ritual, and practical, all at once. The little lights you see in the village are not just candles. They are the outline of decisions, of stories kept alive from one season to the next, and of the human will to keep a flame that names hope.